Hello, welcome to our latest webinar, Customs in the New ACE Environment Part 2. Today we're going to be discussing Customs Forms 28, 29. I'm Nick Esposito. I'll be your host today. I'm a marketing executive here at TRG, and one of my favorite aspects of my position is that I get to be an educator, especially when it comes to these webinars. We love putting them together, and I hope you guys all enjoy them. Joining me today is Gregg Cummings, Managing Partner and a licensed customs broker from our sister company, Strix. This webinar is being presented by Strix and Trade Risk Guaranty. We're located in the heart of downtown Bozeman, Montana, which, for any of our winter enthusiasts out there, is having a killer snow year. Bridger Bowl, our local ski hill, has received 240 inches of snow since November. So if you love the snow and playing outside, this winter's a good year to check out Bozeman. If you do make it to Bozeman, don't forget to stop by our shared office space on the second floor of the historic Rocking R Bar building. Both companies operate on a direct-to-importer business model that is unique to the international trade community. As an important disclaimer, the information presented in this webinar is for information purposes only and is not intended and does not constitute legal advice. We'll be recording this webinar and it'll be available on YouTube for future reference. To be notified the moment it releases and to keep a pulse on TRG's educational videos, I highly recommend that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find this by searching Trade Risk Guarantee on YouTube or by reaching out to us. If you have any questions during the presentation, submit it via the questions section of the webinar interface. The questions will be reviewed and answered by Gregg or our team of licensed customs brokers at the end of or shortly after the webinar. If you have any additional questions outside the webinar and you'd like to be a part of our community of trade professionals, join our Facebook group, International Trade Professionals. Without further ado, here's Gregg to kick off the webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Looks like we got a little curveball thrown at us by GoToWebinar, so luckily we were able to get past that and to get started. So sorry for the late start. We're going to cover some important topics today. We won't take up too much of your time given the late start, but we've got some good things to cover. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some industry news that's out there as well. So we'll talk a little bit on ACE, a little overview and recap. Some of you probably heard that from our previous webinar. And today in particular, we're going to talk a little bit about requests for information. What's CBP doing today in our current ACE environment, and what does it mean to you? What will happen if you see requests for information, notices of action? What should you do? And then we'll talk about a couple of key takeaways, some tips and some ideas that we have in helping you with your import program. So first, let's talk a little bit about ACE, what ACE is, what's going on out there. Of course, ACE, most of us know, is the updated system that Customs now uses to process your data, process your documentation. The acronym, of course, something that CBP is very good at, is ACE, or the Automated Commercial Environment. And what it really is, it's a dramatic improvement. I mean, we were living in a system that, that was in place for many years, and Customs, as we had all hoped, moved to what's called the single window system that now all imports and exports are processed through. So in the past, we had a lot of manual processes and we had a lot of paper. And what this system is designed to do is to streamline that, make it more automated, and try to eliminate some of the things that were friction-oriented in the past or created time delays. And hopefully in the end, it's going to allow the trade community to more easily and efficiently comply with all of the US laws and regulations around importation, you know, some of which seem to be increasing as the years go by. It's always important to start by talking about informed compliance. And in the US in particular, you, the importer, have a relatively large burden, because Customs expect you to understand all of the regulations about your documentation, about your importation, so that it's done in a regulatory compliant way. So we as importers, we get kind of used to hearing that term compliance, because it's important that we are compliant as an importer, because you, the importer, are expected to understand all these components and to exercise them in what's called a reasonable care. Because at the end of the day, of course, you are the one who's liable for the accuracy of your import documentation. So while you may use a third party to assist you, freight forwarder, a customs broker, in the end, the accuracy of that data and everything that's done is your responsibility. So Customs puts out a lot of informed compliance information so that you'll understand the regulations, and then you have to put policies and procedures in place to exercise what's called reasonable care. Now, what's the current state of ACE? Okay, and so many of us know that this has been a very expensive endeavor, $4 billion of our tax dollars at work over 18 years. But the good news is that ACE is now nearing full deployment. From a customs point of view, from a CBP data point of view, we can say that it is fully deployed. So for those of you who are not involved with any agency documentation, ACE has been in place for a number of years, which has been very good. What's been even more difficult to kind of finalize and get across that line, or the final mile, if you will, is the partnering government agencies. And what we saw is when ACE began to set up for programming all of the agencies to bring them into that single window, the agencies kind of took a little time to say, well, we've been getting this set of data for a long time, but what we'd really like is to get this additional set of data too. So they changed a couple of the data requirements depending on which agencies you're dealing with, and each of the agencies has been in charge of their own programming and getting things finalized through ACE. So now, of course, the question is, how's it going to affect us? How is it affecting you, the importer, with these new systems? And of course, whenever the government has access to more data, and they've got access to people who can write algorithms to look at that data, you can be assured that they're going to look a little bit more closely and be able to look more closely at what you're doing. So the ability to target mistakes and inconsistencies in your entry data has improved to levels that have never before been seen in the industry. So what you're seeing are more exams, you're seeing more requests for information, and this is because customs import specialists are looking at your data in ways that they couldn't look at it before. They've really got access to important levels to cross-check and look at not just what you're doing, but look at what you're doing in comparison to what other people who are importing similar goods in similar industries from the same suppliers. So you can expect that customs is not going to decrease this scrutiny, they're going to increase it. And one thing that, of course, is coming out of that is those requests for information. And what we're seeing as a customs broker as well as a software provider is that it's happening at different levels. And customs is kind of working themselves through how they're going to do this best in the future as well. But we see things starting with emails coming from an import specialist, getting a phone call from an import specialist, moving up to more formal requests for information, which are CF28s, which may or may not lead to a CF29, which is a notice of action. So let's take a look at these requests for information and get a better understanding of what they are and how they can affect you. Okay? So why might I get a request for information? And again, this could start in something as innocuous as an email or a phone call with customs requesting information, up to a formal CF28. But there are a number of reasons that you might receive one. Okay, the first and most prevalent one is classification. What HTS codes are you using for the goods that you're bringing in? And customs has a point of view on this, and they are going to take a look at what you're bringing in, and again, be able to cross-check that against other industries and other suppliers. And if they've got a question and they're not sure, you might get a request for information. Another important thing that's out there is intellectual property rights, trade names, copyrights, brands. Are you bringing in goods that you've got branded or has a trade name associated with it? This is a big deal for customs because that's monetary value to the companies who have those brands and own those copyrights. So look very closely at that. What's the valuation? Okay, what are you showing customs as your entered value, either at the line value and a total value, because that's where your duties and fees are processed against. Are you doing business with a related party? Are you part of a subsidiary company that's global in nature, and are you bringing goods from factories that are related? Customs cares about that because of the accounting. There's a perception that accounting could be fudged, and of course that's historically been the case in some cases. And so customs looks at that because internal accounting could be a way for you to avoid valuation and certain pricing, which again the duties and fees are based on. And of course we all know anti-dumping, a big deal. It's in the news. More industries, more products are becoming subject to that as we try to, perhaps equal the playing field as far as products are concerned. So again, the most prevalent thing that we see is a request for information regarding a classification, regarding a tariff code. And of course, we know that these codes are used to determine the classifications for goods. Those have a duty rate, or they might be duty free. But that classification is determined on a pretty straightforward basis. What's the name, the use, the material used for construction? And what we'd like you to think about is, how are you classifying your goods? Because it's so important and it is being reviewed by customs, how are you doing it? An age-old way for smaller, perhaps less resource-oriented importers is you use your customs broker. And being a customs broker, we've got a team of people who are expert in classifying goods. And it's something that's we become expert in. When you get licensed, it's a very big part of the test. So you must know how to classify goods. And so using your customs broker to do that is very much understood by customs to be a good practice. We might suggest, though, that especially if your imports are increasing, if you can bring that in-house, a best practice to have an internal team, a team of your company. We always say, who knows your products better than you, which means that you ought to be able to classify those goods as good as any broker out there. So what happens? Let's say we get a request for information. It's a CF28. What's that stand for? Well, in all their ability to be creative, it's Customs Form 28. So pretty straightforward there, but it's a request for information. And what it's really saying is that if customs finds that the information that's given to them during the normal entry process is incomplete, it's inaccurate, insufficient, they have some kind of a question that doesn't allow them to make a quick decision or agreement with what's been put in, then they're going to send out a form asking you to clarify. Give us additional information so we can be certain that what you did was correct, or if, as is usually the case, they've got a question that it's not, they can overcome that. Okay? When you get this report or you get this form, you've got 30 days after the issue date to respond in writing to customs. This is very important because if that response is not received within that time frame, then customs is going to keep moving forward. They're going to make a determination on their own with the information that they have available. So oftentimes you might find that that's not the most favorable interpretation of what you believe the correct facts are. Okay, and that might leave you with a financial disadvantage. You might get a duty bill, you might get a fine or a penalty. So it's very important that you take these forms seriously and respond to them in that time period. And if that means you need to talk to your broker about it, we do this in conjunction with importers all day long. Then that's what you do. But you want to be complete. You want to get that out to them as quickly as you can. Now this is a quick look at what a CF28 looks like. Pretty official looking form. And it's going to ask you to fill out a series of check boxes and to essentially describe or improve on the detail the customs is looking for. And here's a very important part of the CF28, okay? And you can see this kind of near the bottom here, and it says, I hereby certify this information is correct. It's true and correct. And it's going to be a person, usually an officer of the company, that's going to sign this. So, you're stating to Customs that all these facts are true and complete. So when Customs goes back and they take a look at this information, if they've got an alternative point of view, you're the one who's going to be liable. So it's very important to really take these things seriously. So what's the process? When you get at the time of entry, shortly thereafter, what happens is Customs continues to review your data. And if they feel that it's been misclassified, uncertain of the details, they're going to issue a 28 asking you for that additional information. Again, if they don't receive that information timely, or if you do it kind of marginally, so the information is marginal or incomplete, then they may move directly to a determination on their own, informing you, the importer, of that action to be taken. So depending on what that CF29, that notice of action, may state, you might receive a supplemental duty bill. It's going to change the duty rate on the goods that you brought in, and you might get a bill for that. So now we move to what's called the CF29. Again, very creative, Customs Form 29 is what that stands for. And now we've moved essentially from that request for information to a notice of action. Okay, so Customs has said, kind of thank you for that information, however good or not that it was, and here is what we think about that. Here is our notice of action to be taken. So when in particular, let's say Customs believes there should be a change in the classification, then they might move you from the classification you put in that might be duty free, and they might move you to a classification that has a duty rate on that. So very important to understand that these notices of action are kind of difficult to get past. We've kind of moved past the information stage. We've received that action by Customs, and that signifies their intention to change the way that that entry was classified or valued, et cetera, whatever that change might be, and it dictates to you how all your future shipments will be treated. So the notice of action is not singular in nature. It's going to affect, kind of funny there, how all of your entries are going to need to look from there. So again, when you get that CF29, you actually might get action taken or action proposed. The action proposed is kind of like that final, all right, we've gotten information. We're going to give you kind of one last shot here. You got 20 days to respond and try to overcome what Customs believes the action taken is or should be. If you received a direct action taken, then Customs, again, they're indicating that this action has been taken. Could be an increase, could even be a decrease in duties, because at the end of the day, Customs is looking for correct classifications, and it could be up, could be down. As you might imagine, most of them are up. But from there, you've kind of moved past your ability to really have that discussion with Customs anymore. It can only be addressed from a protest from there. So here's what a CF29 is going to look like. Again, fairly straightforward, official looking form. We've got some highlights there that are kind of difficult to read, so I'll move to this next slide. And there's some things on here that that are kind of important. And in this particular one, Customs is highlighting and saying, you sent us a 28, you sent us some information back, and we're telling you that a 1 or 2 word description on this product is inadequate, wasn't adequate to describe the merchandise. So we kind of took the information that you gave us, and in the end, you can see highlighted on the second line there, CBP does not agree with the classification that's declared at the time of entry for these particular lines in that entry. And so as such, they're going to give you what the correct classification is. And in this case, we moved from a no duty rate to 4.2%. Now you can imagine, if you have brought your goods in, you have sold them into commerce at a particular expected price point and margin. If you receive this back and you have 4.2% shaved off that, well, we're in a skinny economic environment out there. That could take either a very large portion, if not all the portion of your profit out. So this is really important to get the kind of information in as full as you can to customs. Now let's also take a look at the last highlighted note down there. Please note, future shipments or identical or similar merchandise should be entered accordingly to the findings above, is what they're referring to. And in order for you to be in compliance with these instructions, any future entries not in conformity with these instructions will be rejected. So that again says, if you get a notice of action, customs expects you to, if you're a self-filer, classify those goods accordingly in the future, or if you're using third-party resources, the customs broker or brokers, that you let them know what those classifications have been put into action. So it's very important. It's kind of like customs says, okay, you were wrong. Here's the right classification, and here's your duty bill. And there may not be a fine or penalty involved with that. It's just, here's what the duty should have been in the first place. You need to pay it. Now, if you go back and you misclassify it again, as you did in the past, they're going to lose their sense of humor on that, and a fine and penalty will probably also become part of that. So let's talk about, kind of the policies and procedures we ought to have in place for these kinds of things. And the first easy one is review your HTS classifications today. Take a look. Hopefully you've got a parts list. You've got a parts master where you've got a part number and a classification associated with it. If you're not that formal, whatever or however you're classifying your goods, take a look at it again. It's always good to do that at the beginning of the year and make sure that the classifications that perhaps have been in place are correct. And you might, again, take a look at some third-party resources to help you in that. But, one point that we think is very important is don't let a foreign supplier classify your goods. And we see this all too often, especially on the brokerage side, where we talk to an importer, usually, smaller volume or someone who's new, and they're like, oh no, I got the classification from my supplier. It's duty free. Well, of course it is, because that's what they want it to be for you to be happy with the purchase that you've made. It gets even worse if you get into a tariff code that may be subject to anti-dumping. And we've seen several very painful examples where goods were ordered, they came in, the tariff code could be subject to anti-dumping. Of course, when you ask the supplier, they're of course not subject to it, but under further scrutiny, they were. And so that can be a very ugly outcome that you don't want to happen. If you get a CF28, or if you get a request for information anyway, what is your SOP? What's your operating protocol? Have a very clear action plan in place, okay? If you get that, talk with a team internally. If you've got a good, solid compliance team, have a discussion with your broker about what it is, what they're asking for, how you should reply, because those 28s and 29s are date specific. You want to elevate that quickly, and you want to get with whatever expert team you can as quickly as possible to get the information set up and back to customs as quickly as possible. Of course, not all your 28s and 29s are centered around classification. So what we're suggesting is you should be auditing your broker. We get audited all the time by our clients and by third-party resources. Why? Because it's a good best practice. Is the information that you're giving us as a broker being utilized correctly as you expect it to be? Are those entries reflecting the information from classification to valuation to property rights? Is your broker doing what you expect them to do? Because at the end of the day, if they're not, then customs comes to you for fines and penalties and for the action of those mistakes. So, it's important to ensure through an audit that the broker is submitting that information. And it's also important for you internally to make sure that we get that information accurately and timely, so it's part of that entry and it's part of the import process. So we've covered a lot of things today. We've gone over ACE recap. We've talked about request for information, notice of actions, and a couple of key takeaways. So as you put together some questions, we're interested in answering them. A quick note on Strix, for those of you who don't know us, we kind of occupy a very interesting place in the trade because we are both a software provider to allow you to self-file your ISF or your customs entry, but we're also a full-service custom house brokerage. So we do full-service brokerage in ISF all day long, and we do a full menu of partnership with clients who self-file some of their business and they outsource some of it to us. One thing I would like to say that's out there in the trade that's kind of timely, and that is for those of you who are involved either via your freight forwarder or directly with the shipping line for a shipping line contract coming up here in the next couple of months. There's been some interesting developments on the dray side, and that's the container offloading. What we're seeing is that there's been a tremendous amount of pressure at the ports in getting containers and getting the product that last mile out. So what we're seeing is that many ocean carriers are looking to limit the number of their store door contracts that roll over on May 1st. And in large part, the ocean carriers are declining to offer the door service because of this capacity shortage. So carriers that agreed to door rates in the past with customers have found that finding truckers who they had contracted with to provide those moves are either unable or unwilling to provide the capacity that was negotiated. So this is a bottleneck that's really important. You know, we live in this just-in-time kind of environment for our factories and for our warehouses and delivery to our customers. So if you have a contract with a steamship line and the goods are duly shipped to a port, but once they get there, the contracts, and these can be complicated. You know, Maersk requires that their dray provider use their chassis and not another chassis from the pool. Some of the dray providers that contracted at aggressive rates with the steamship lines don't have capacity, or they've all of a sudden become unwilling to fulfill that capacity because the rates are down, the spot rates are down, and they're getting a lot higher rates. So be aware as these contracts come up in May, we might see a different environment unfolding out there as far as that last mile in your dray rates. So as a broker and as a dray provider, trucking provider, we get involved in this quite a bit, and we've seen a lot of pain here in the past couple of months because that container that got delivered sometimes was 1, 2, and even 3 weeks delayed getting to the final warehouse, the final delivery point. So a lot of you out there really don't like that to be the case. So, you know, it may be that you might be taking or looking at a port delivery, then taking care of that transportation yourself. If that's the case, make sure you know you've got access to a good provider. All right, so let's start some questions. The first one is if we get an informal request from CBP via phone or email, you know, are we going to see that through the ACE portal? Also, aren't the Cs supposed to use the ACE portal for inquiries? You know, the Cs may or may not be using ACE for that. You, as an importer, you should have access to ACE. You should get signed up and you should get familiar with ACE, because the ability to view a CF28 in ACE is there today, and you've actually got an ability to respond to a 28 out of the ACE portal. So get familiar with it and use it where you can. Now, if CBP calls us up and says, hey, we've got some question on that, you know, I guess we look at that as being serious because there's some question involved in that shipment. But today, the way that things are set up is we've got the ability to download documentation via the document imaging system. So that system is still there, and used in the kind of informal stage. Can I protest a rate increase without paying the duty? Nope. Customs gives you a notice of action. That is a notice of action and a supplementing duty bill that must be paid, unless it's, of course, you get the, proposed notice of action. You got another 20 minutes or 20 days. Hopefully it's not that short. But you got to pay that. And if in the future that protest is successful, then you would get a refund, but you've got to pay that duty. Otherwise, you're going to be kind of in contempt of the order. So, next question: do these notices go straight to the importer company or to the broker? Will the broker assist in the investigation? That's something we talked a little bit about earlier. These notices go to you. Always goes to the importer of record. Now, I can tell you as a broker and as a software provider, if you get one, contact me immediately, because we get very involved in this. We can kind of, work through a little of the gray areas, help you understand it better, but they're coming to you because that is, Customs has a bond, they've got an address. It gets back a little bit to our last webinar where we say, have a policy and procedure in place to receive notices. They are serious. If you get a 28 and it goes unseen because it ends up in someone's box who wasn't supposed to get it, they didn't know what it was, that's a problem, because Customs may have moved to a notice of action without your reply. And they don't have a sense of humor when you say, dog ate the homework. We had one asking about if you happen to be involved in a particular commodity like potatoes or something else food related, would a 28 or 29 pertain to your business? It is not product specific. 28s or 29s are on any potential imported product that come into the United States. So it doesn't matter if it's fish or steel, potatoes or potatoes. I recently received a 28. Is it okay to send all the information back by email to the CBP official? You will provide in the back. Yes, it is. I would send it FedEx. I would send it so that it was received and signed for duly by them. And again, if you want a couple more eyes on that, give us a ring, and we're happy to help out with that. But I always like to know it was received and have that record. Really thank you for attending today. Hopefully we covered some things of interest and helped you out. If you've got additional questions, please give us a ring. And thanks again for attending.